So Romans 12, we are going to start in about verse 9 where we left off from last week. And last week we talked about how Christians are uniquely called to be united. And then this week we're going to hear Paul kind of continue to speak about how we should treat one another. Okay? So we're going to start in Romans 12, verse 9. Let love be genuine. Abhor what is evil. Hold fast to what is good. Love one another with brotherly affection. Outdo one another in showing love. Do not be slothful in zeal. Be fervent in spirit. Serve the Lord. Rejoice in hope. Be patient in tribulation. Be consistent in prayer. Contribute to the needs of the saints and seek to show hospitality. So if you're looking for a checklist in Scripture, this is a really good one, okay? We want to say all the do nots, do not do this, do not do this, do not do this. And Paul here is giving us a whole list of things to do, to be in relationship with one another. And the first thing he says there is to let your love be genuine, okay? Because if love contains hypocrisy, then it's really not love, even if it looks like love on the outside. And he even calls us to outdo one another in showing that love and that honor while we serve the Lord. Okay? I'm so glad that we have so many people here. We come up here. This is awesome. I love it. We're in Romans 9 for those of you, or Romans 12 for those of you who are just joining us. Yes, please, come on. There's some more chairs down here. Come on. Be front row.
There's a choir, so you're coming late.
No, come on in. We're just doing Romans 12, jumping in verse 9. We're good? We're good? Thank you. No, it's this way. All right, so Romans 12, verse 9. So we're talking about love. Let your love be genuine. Outdo showing love and honor to one another. Okay, imagine if each one of us that was our goal every time we were together. I'm going to outdo you, showing love to you and honor. Okay, that would be an incredible goal for all of us to have. And then Paul says to serve God, rejoicing in hope, not results. Okay, so we rejoice in the hope that what God is going to do, not rejoicing in the results, not rejoicing in the numbers or what we can see sometimes. Okay, and then he says that difficult times do not excuse us for when we abandon our hope, or when we are not patient, or when we are not continually steadfastly in prayer. Also, trials do not excuse us when we have a lack of love for one another or a willingness to do God's work. Okay, so we are without excuse of what God has called us to do. And then I love the Greek word for hospitality there in the verse. It actually translates love for strangers. Okay, that is hospitality. And to show there is a strong word is sometimes translated to pursue. Okay, to hunt somebody down. So this is the word picture there. That you are hunting down strangers with your love. That's the word picture there in the Greek. Okay, you're going after them. That's love in action. Okay, that's how we love our neighbor, love the other people. Right? So let's go down to verse 14 in Romans 12. Bless those who persecute you. Bless and do not curse them. Rejoice with those who rejoice. Weep with those who weep. Live in harmony with one another. Do not be haughty. Be associated with the lowly. Never be wise in your own sight. Repay no evil for evil, but give thought to what is honorable in the sight of all. If possible, so far as it depends on you, live peaceably with all. Beloved, never avenge yourself, but leave it to the wrath of God. For it is written, vengeance is mine, I will repay, says the Lord. To the contrary, if your enemy is hungry, feed him. If he is thirsty, give him something to drink. For by so doing you will heap burning coals on his head. Do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good. Okay? So we're not to have a hateful attitude towards other people. Okay? Even those who persecute us, even those who would want to see us fail, we should not have a hateful attitude towards them. And Paul is also cautioning us to have a humble mindset, to remember who we are and how far we have to go. Okay, we haven't arrived, we're not perfect, so we need to remain humble. And then he recalls Jesus' command in Matthew 5 of repay no evil for evil, because that's our society, right? When somebody hurts us, when somebody does evil against us, we want to repay them with the same thing. We want an eye for an eye. We want, to have that. But we are called to love our enemies, and also to live in harmony with everyone so far as it depends on us. Because I'm telling you, humans are messy. You're not going to get along with everyone. I'm sorry if you think that that's going to be a goal in your life. It's an unrealistic goal. But so far as it depends on you, attempt to live in harmony with everyone. Okay? And then he goes so far as to say, do not avenge yourself. It is not your job to take vengeance on that person. It is the Lord's. And he actually quotes there from Deuteronomy. And he's saying that the end result of justice is in God's hands, not yours. Okay? And then he goes on to say a verse that is often misquoted out of hand. If you do all of these things and you're able to accomplish all of these, you're going to reap just burning coals on top of their head. And that just symbolizes, hell and damnation and all of these things. That has nothing to do with the context. Everything in the context is don't repay evil for evil. Don't get vengeance on them. Don't do all of these things. Okay? So it kind of sounds like Paul's having a contrast here that we get to stick it to our enemies if we don't do all of these things, right? But in the ancient Eastern culture, the point was when you had someone over to your house and you stayed for a long time, you would send live coals home with them so that if their fire had gone out at their house, they would have a head start to restart their fire, okay? Or if a neighbor and their fire had gone out, they would come over to you and ask for part of yours, and that you would give them live coals. And of course, you just can't hand them a live coal in your hand, right? You would have to protect it. Okay? So the interpretation here is that Paul is calling us to live peaceably and to not repay, and then that is going to be taken to the neighbor, and then it is going to help them. And you're going to basically plant that seed for them and spark it into a fire. And he's actually quoting here from Proverbs, okay? So if the context wasn't enough for you, go to Proverbs 25, and see what Paul did not finish the quote. Okay, so Proverbs 25, verse 21, if your enemy is hungry, give him bread to eat. Paul said that, okay? If he is thirsty, give him water to drink. Paul says that. For you will heap burning coals on his head. Paul says that, but he stops there. The very next end of that sentence is, and the Lord will reward you. Okay? So if he's going to say, do not get vengeance on yourself, that's what Paul is talking about here. If you do all of these things, I'm going to reward you because you're being obedient. Okay? So let's be careful with our quoting verses out of context there. All right? So it's not about vengeance. It's about love and peace and living in harmony. Okay? So let's go on to chapter 13, starting in verse 7, which seems completely out of context for Paul, right? But remember, Paul's writing one letter here. We get to verse 1 and we say, let everyone be subject to the governing authorities. And we go, Paul, what are you talking about here? Right? We seem like we've switched topics here, but Paul hasn't. So let's continue on. For there is no authority except from God, and those that exist have been instituted by God. Therefore, whoever resists the authorities resists what God has appointed. And those who resist will incur judgment. For rulers are not a terror to good conduct, but to bad. Would you have no fear for the one who is in authority? Then do what is good, and you will receive his approval. For he is God's servant for good. But if you do wrong, be afraid. For he does not bear the sword in vain. For he is the servant of God, an avenger who carries out God's wrath on the wrongdoer. Therefore, one must be in subject, not only to avoid God's wrath, but also for the sake of conscience. For because of this, you also pay taxes, for the authorities are ministers of God, attending to this very thing. Pay to all what is due to them. Taxes to whom taxes is due, revenue to whom revenue is owed, respect to whom respect is owed, and honor to whom honor is owed. Okay? So Paul is actually making a clear connection here between what we're just called to do and the government. Okay? It's Christians, if they're not seeking their own personal vengeance, okay, we need to give that right over to what God has instituted, which is government, okay? It is government's job to take care of the wrongdoers, the people who are breaking the law. It's not their job to come and tell you, hey, you're doing right, I'm going to give you a cookie and a star today. That's not the government's job, right? The government's job is that if somebody breaks into your house and steals your things, then they go after that person and pay retribution to you, okay? That's the government's job. So what Paul is trying to show you here is the relationship to believers is kind of very similar to this. We need to make sure where our place is here. So if it's not our job to avenge, we need to put that on the government, okay? But what he's saying here is that God is using government to do those very things, to pay for vengeance, okay? And what he is talking about is in contrast to this group of Jews at the time who believed that because their government at the time, which was Rome, was not a God-honoring government, that they didn't have to listen to them. They didn't have to pay taxes, that they didn't have to agree with their laws, that they didn't have to obey. They could just do whatever they wanted to do. And Paul is saying that's not the case here. Even ungodly government is put there for a reason, okay? And then he goes on to explain the different reasons that God uses each and every one of them to do his own purpose and his own will, whether they like to admit it or not, whether they're willing to be part of that plan or not, that God uses each part of governance, okay? And then God appoints these national leaders, but sometimes not always to bless people. Like, that's what we want. We want a government that's going to bless me, right? That's not what God often uses, okay? Sometimes that's the case. Sometimes it's to ripen a people or a nation for judgment, okay? We see that a lot in the Old Testament. And remember, Paul is writing during the Roman Empire. They hated Christians. They tried to kill them and squash them at every turn. And Paul is going, yeah, those guys are who I want you to listen to. Those guys are who I want you to pay taxes to, because it's the right thing to do and honoring in God's sight, okay? They are this legitimate authority that God has put in place, okay? And you are going to obey God by obeying who he has put in place, all right? So, since the governments have these authorities from God, we are bound to obey them, unless, okay, we're going to put a little asterisk there, unless they do something contrary to God's law. And we are taught this in Acts 4:19. We are commanded to obey God above men, but that doesn't mean we never obey government and men and things like that, okay? So we have to be careful there, that yes, we are called to obey, but not just blindly and without ever understanding why they're doing what they're doing, okay? So be very careful there.
How do we know, as a group of people, when those that are in charge, so the government, is no longer following God's rule, and we are now supposed to facilitate a change to bring back God's law?
Right.
When we follow that, because I'm sure it's a very fine...
It's a fine line, and that's mostly understanding what the expectations that God has for his people in his word. And then when we see the government blatantly going against that, that is not the time to obey. Okay, that's the time to say, God has said this, and this is the line that God has drawn, not me. Okay, and that is hard. Okay, because the government, again, is not always going to be God honoring, right? So that's going to be on an individual basis.
And there's certain things that you can definitely are not God honoring,
right.
And there's other things that are like, well, I don't agree with it, but it's not necessarily wrong.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, that's a hard one. That's a gray area that we're going to have to be very careful with. So that's why I gave that little asterisk of this. We're not called to blindly follow all authority. We're called to follow authority as God has given it until they cross over God's lines. Not our preference, not what we would want to do, but God's clear lines. Okay? All right, so Paul's idea here is that basically we should be the best citizens of all because we are obeying, we are going to be loyal, but we're also going to pray for those in leadership. Okay? That is what we're called to do as a people, is to pray for those rulers, that God would use them, that God would help them, that God would direct them. Okay? And then he also says that government is used to punish evil. That sword there is that the Romans, they chopped people's heads off. That's how they executed people. So that is the symbol there, that when you are convicted of wrongdoing, they take care of those wrongdoers. Okay, so by that, they're being the arm of God to avenge that. Okay? But when government fails to do this consistently, they open up themselves to God's judgment and God's wrath. And we see that all throughout the Old Testament as well. When Israel did not stand up and do what it was supposed to do, God sent other nations to rule over them and to get them back into line. Okay? So we are to pay taxes, because in doing that, we're supporting God's work. Okay? And then by implication, Romans 13:6 says that tax collecting should be used by the government to restrain evil. That's the whole point of why we give them taxes, so that they can do the job that God has assigned them, not to line their pockets and build up wealth and things like that, which is also kind of messy in our society here. So we are to give money, honor, reverence, all in proper accordance, but while reserving our right to give God what is due to God first and foremost. Okay? So a little tricky there, a little muddy, but hopefully that kind of clears it up a little bit better for you. All right, verse 8. Owe no one anything. So again, kind of seems like a weird transition, but you see Paul's kind of connecting the dots here, where he's talking about owe to what is owed, and then owe no one anything except to love each other. For the one who loves another has fulfilled the law. For the commands, you shall not commit adultery, you shall not murder, you shall not steal, you shall not covet, and any other commandment are all summed up in this word. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. Love does no wrong to a neighbor, therefore love is the fulfilling of the law. Okay? So Paul is now talking about personal relationships. We've gone from government back to personal. So the debt that we owe one another is love. And that's what we should be paying back every day, is that debt love that we owe one another. This is an obligation that we should be carrying out every day in our relationships. Okay? So some take this as a command that Paul is trying to say that we should never let anyone else borrow money from us. Okay? When Jesus has some passages like in Matthew 5:14 where he kind of permits it. Okay? But we're not talking about money here. That's only part of how we owe one another. He's also talking about the love, the honor, the respect. Okay? Those are the things that we are obligated to give one another freely and not expect something in return. Okay? Now, loving your neighbor means to love the people that you are around, that you come in contact with. Remember, it's not just the people who live on either side of you on your street. It is the people who you sit beside in Sunday school class and in service and meet in the grocery store and all these different places where you run into people. But that's not always easy, because we're all messy people. Okay? We all have our own baggage, we all have our own trauma, all the things that we're dealing with, all the stresses that we're dealing with. It's not always easy to love people, okay? But just because it isn't easy doesn't mean we have an excuse not to do it, okay? We can do all of these religious things and check all the boxes and never love anyone. And that's what Paul is trying to get here. Don't neglect love, because it is the measure of obedience that you are obeying the Lord. Okay? God doesn't care if you fill out every single Sunday that you were checked the box that I showed up in a room and I sat here and listened. He's asking you, did you love somebody today? Did you show them who I am through your actions? Okay? And then verse 11 through 14. Besides this, you know the time, that the hour has come for you to wake from sleep. For salvation is nearer to us now than when we first believed. The night is far gone, the day is at hand. So then let us cast off the works of darkness and put on the armor of light. I love that picture, such a pretty picture. Let us walk properly as in the daytime, not in orgies and drunkenness, not in sexual immorality or sensuality, not in quarreling and jealousy, but put on the Lord Jesus Christ and make no provision for the flesh to gratify your desires. Okay? So because we know that the Lord is coming back and that there's a date on his calendar that is marked, and Paul's going, listen, we're closer to that date than we were yesterday. And we go, yeah, Paul, we're still waiting on that 2,000 years later. Okay? It seems really hard. But he's saying it's closer now than ever. We have a commitment to wake up, to not fall asleep and to be drowsy and to just ho-hum through our lives. Wake up, okay? Be active. And he's saying that yeah, you can do all these religious things, and you can be asleep towards God and towards people, but that's not what God has for you. God has this amazing walk that he wants you to walk, and if you're asleep, you can't be walking that. Okay? You'll be sleepwalking, bumping into things, and going all kinds of different directions. He's going to wake up, open your eyes. I've got so much planned for you, okay? And then he has a little bit of warning here. The flesh is active, okay? You have to get your spiritual body out of bed and wake up. The flesh doesn't need that. It's already way active. It's already doing all the things that it wants to do. So he's reminding them, hey, you need to get that flesh in alignment, okay? Get it reined in because it's going to do all the things that it wants to do. So getting the spirit and the body in a willing, active partnership with the Lord. And we do that by putting on what Christ has given us, okay? Not ourselves, right? He gives us that armor of light. He gives us Christ and his righteousness, okay? So in chapter 14, Paul's going to continue to talk about some ways that Christians should treat one another, and then he's going to go on to give examples in chapter 15 and then kind of say his goodbyes in chapter 16. So those are our next 2 weeks of the book of Romans.